evil spirits. A new house. Sarah and I moved into this house in early autumn. He was standing on top of a hill, surrounded by golden leaves, surrounded by a dense forest. The house was old, built sometime in the early 1900s, with elegantly carved wooden balconies and massive windows that let in daylight. It was a dream home, or so we thought. We were looking for peace and privacy to take a break from the hustle and bustle of the city, and this house was perfect. Locals told us that its previous owners sold it strangely quickly, but we didn't pay attention to it. Old houses often keep their secrets. The first few days passed quietly. We unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, and enjoyed the crunch of leaves underfoot when we went out for walks. Sarah laughed when I tried to attach an old painting over the fireplace, which kept falling down. But even then, I felt something strange. Sometimes, when Sarah was talking, her voice seemed to stay in the air a little longer than it should have. I explained this by the peculiarities of the acoustics of the house. "Interesting," she said one evening, slamming the door. "Have you heard how the echo repeats even such sounds?" I nodded, although in my heart it made me a little wary. The echo seemed too clear, too vivid, as if it wasn't just reflecting the sound, but copying it with excessive precision. The first oddities. The problem started on the third night. Sarah woke up in the middle of the night and woke me up. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I listened. The house was quiet except for the sound of the wind rustling the leaves outside the window. "Number, what did you hear?" "You called me," her voice trembled. "I was asleep," I replied, feeling a chill run down my spine. Sarah snuggled up to me and I tried to calm her down. "It's just an echo. Maybe the sound of the wind was reflected in a strange way." She didn't answer, but I knew she didn't believe me. The next day, I noticed another oddity. When I slammed the door in the hallway, the sound reverberated with such force that I flinched. It wasn't just an echo, it was the same sound, but with minor changes, as if someone was trying to imitate it. Sarah was starting to notice it too. One day, she turned around and said, "You know, this house seems to hear us." Whispers. One night I woke up to a strange sound. It was a whisper, but I couldn't make out the words. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. Sarah was sleeping next to me. Her breathing was even. The whispers grew louder, as if they were right outside the bedroom door. I got up, trying not to wake her up, and went to the door. "Is there anyone?" I whispered, but my voice came back to me. It wasn't my echo. The voice sounded cold, weak, and somehow mocking. The next morning, I decided not to tell Sarah what had happened. She was already stressed out about the oddities at home, and I didn't want to add to her fear. But later in the day, she came up to me. Her face was pale. "Didn't you say that I laugh strangely at night?" she asked. "What?" I was puzzled. "I woke up last night and heard my laughter. But it wasn't me, Alex. It was a house." High-profile secrets. After Sarah's words, I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. The house really lived its life. But how do we explain what we've heard? We tried to joke, to reduce everything to the fact that old houses behave strangely. But internally, I felt that every day the situation was becoming more abnormal. One night, I decided to stay in the living room to work and at the same time listen to the house. Sarah went to bed, asking me to wake her up if I heard anything unusual. The clock showed almost 2 in the morning when it started. At first, there was a faint knocking, as if someone was slowly walking on the floor in the next room. I listened. It must be Sarah. But the sound didn't stop, and when I called out to her, the voice came back to me. "Sarah? Sarah?" The house echoed, but the voice sounded lower and muffled than mine. I stood up, feeling the cold seep into every corner of my body. I walked down the hall towards the bedroom. The door was ajar. Sarah was lying in bed, covered with a blanket. Her breathing was even. I asked, not wanting to wake her up. Her voice sounded suddenly and sharply. "What?" I shuddered. She turned to me, her face pale and scared. "I just heard you in the hallway." I froze. "It wasn't me," she whispered. "The house is talking." We hardly spoke the next day. Each of us tried to find an explanation for what was happening. I've read articles about old houses, acoustics, and possible natural phenomena that could cause such oddities. But nothing worked. Sarah suggested calling an acoustics specialist, but I knew it wouldn't help. The problem wasn't the walls. Later in the afternoon, when I was in the office, Sarah screamed from the kitchen. I rushed there and saw her standing with a knife in her hands. She was trembling all over, and her eyes were full of horror. "I heard you call me," she said, breathing heavily. "You called me, but you were in the office." "Sarah, calm down," I began, but she interrupted me. "No, it was your echo. It repeated your words, but in its own way, as if—" I tried to calm her down, but inside I knew she was right. The house didn't just reflect our sounds. He heard us, and he would start talking. Voices of the past. At night I heard the whispers again, but now it's getting louder. The words were incomprehensible, but there was something alarming in them, as if someone was whispering threats or mocking us. Sarah heard it too. We lay in bed, listening to the whispers that seemed endless. "It's just the wind," I tried to say, but I couldn't believe my words. And then the voice got louder. It was her voice. I turned to Sarah, but she was lying next to me, her eyes wide with fear. "It's not me," she whispered. Tags. After that night, we couldn't stay calm anymore. Voices, whispers, strange noises, it all drove us crazy. We tried to stay awake, but at some point fatigue got the better of us, and we both fell asleep. When I woke up at dawn, I felt that something was wrong. Sarah was still asleep, but her face looked haggard, as if she hadn't rested during the night, but was struggling with something. I touched her shoulder. "Sarah, wake up," I said softly, trying not to scare her. She opened her eyes and looked at me with confusion. "I feel terrible," she muttered. When she sat down, I noticed something strange. There were bruises on her wrists and forearms, as if someone was holding her tightly. "Sarah?" I asked, pointing to her hands. She looked at her wrists and her eyes filled with tears. I don't know. Alex, I swear it didn't happen yesterday." The bruises were clear, as if someone was squeezing her hands with great force. I examined her shoulders and noticed several more similar marks. "You should have hit something," I began, trying to find a logical explanation, but I realized that nothing would add up. Sarah shook her head slowly. "I was asleep. That's all I remember. It's a nightmare. I saw someone standing by our bed. Shadow. And she grabbed my hands." Her words gave me goosebumps. The house is playing with us. All day we tried not to think about it, doing small chores around the house, but fear has already settled in us. Sarah was silent, her gaze constantly wandering to the corners of the room, as if she was looking for something that was hiding in the shadows. I began to notice that the house seemed to be watching us. When I entered the room, I felt a slight but distinct noise, like a stifled sigh. The echo no longer reflected our sounds in the usual way. Now it was living its own life. When I called Sarah, the voice was repeated, but each time it became louder and clearer until it turned into an ominous whisper. "Sarah," I said one evening to see if the echo would come back, and it responded, but the words weren't mine. "She can't hear you." My voice, but spoken by someone else, reverberated throughout the house. I froze. Sarah noticed my condition and came up to me. I didn't want to scare her, but I knew there was no point in hiding it anymore. "The house is talking, Sarah. He's telling us something, and I'm afraid to find out what it is." She looked at me, and her eyes filled with tears. "Alex, I'm scared. I do not know what is going on, but this house, he wants something from us." The relentless darkness. That night we decided not to go to bed. We were sitting in the living room, hugging each other, as if it could protect us from something unknown. The embers in the fireplace were barely smoldering, casting a faint orange light on the walls. Everything looked quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that calms down. It was a silence that oppressed, forced one to listen to every rustle. "Do you think it could just be our nerves?" Sarah whispered, her voice sounding uncertain. I wanted to agree, to say that all this is a figment of our imagination. But I couldn't. "No, Sarah," I said, feeling my heart tighten. "It's not us. This is the place." The clock struck midnight. Their ringing rang through the house. It seemed much louder than usual. Sarah shuddered. At that moment, I heard it again. Whisper. But now he wasn't hiding behind walls. He was right here in the room with us. "Can you hear me?" The words were slow, drawn out, as if someone could barely pronounce them. I looked around the room but saw nothing but emptiness. Sarah noticed my gaze and squeezed my hand. I nodded, not taking my eyes off the dark corner of the room where the light from the fireplace couldn't reach. And then it happened. There was a creaking sound from the darkness, as if someone was slowly moving across the wooden floor. I stood up, feeling goosebumps all over my body. I shouted, but the voice of the house echoed back to me. "Who's here?" The whisper was repeated, but this time with mockery, with terrifying precision. Sarah screamed when the fire in the fireplace suddenly went out, leaving us in total darkness. The call of the house. We were rushing around the room, trying to find the light. My hands were shaking as I searched for matches. There was another sound in the darkness, a knock, faint at first, but growing louder. It came from all sides, as if the walls were shrinking around us. Sarah suddenly screamed, "Alex!" I turned to her and saw her struggling with something invisible, as if her wrists were being squeezed by invisible hands. I rushed to her, trying to pull her out of this trap. But when I grabbed her, the house responded. "She will stay." The voice was deep, almost animal, and it came from everywhere. Sarah started crying, her body shaking in my arms. I hugged her and screamed, "Leave us alone!" Silence. And then the door to the living room slowly opened, as if inviting us out, fighting the darkness. We didn't move towards the open door. Sarah squeezed my hand so hard that I thought she was going to break her fingers. Her eyes were fixed on the darkening doorway, from which an icy cold breathed, as if death itself stood behind it. "It's a trap," she whispered, and I could see her body shaking. I nodded, trying to stay calm, but panic was raging inside me. We stayed where we were, slowly backing toward the center of the room, where there was still a faint light from the dying embers in the fireplace. And that's when it started. The floor under Sarah suddenly trembled. She screamed when something grabbed her legs. I looked down and saw how her ankles seemed to be enveloped in shadows, thick and alive, like oil creeping up. "Alex!" she screamed, her voice filled with terror. I grabbed her by the arms, trying to pull her out of those terrible clutches. "Hold on! I won't let you go!" The shadows began to pull her down, as if the floor was becoming liquid and trying to swallow her up. I pulled with all my might, feeling something resisting, an invisible force trying to pull it away from me. "It's pulling me!" screamed Sarah, her face distorted with fear. And suddenly her body rose abruptly, as if an invisible hand had pulled her out of the clutches of the floor. She screamed as she was jerked against the wall. I barely had time to grab her hand when she hit it. The shadows continued to envelop her, twisting her body and pulling her up. I felt my heart stop when she started to climb the wall, as if she was attracted by an unknown force. "Don't let go of me," she screamed, and I squeezed her hands with all my might. Her body jerked as the shadows dragged her to the ceiling. She hung there as if glued, and thick black streams swirled around her. I jumped to grab her hand. She was dangling in the air like a doll, and I was trying my best to pull her back. And suddenly I heard a whisper. "She's ours. Leave her alone," I shouted, pulling Sarah down with all my strength. The shadows began to shrink, and I saw her face contort in pain. "Alex, please!" she screamed, her voice shaking with terror. I grabbed a nearby chair and threw it out the window with all my might. The glass shattered and the cold night air rushed into the room. Sarah plummeted down as if invisible paws had lost their grip. I picked her up and we rushed to the broken window. The walls shook as if something inside the house was even more angry. We climbed over the windowsill, cutting our hands on the glass, and fell on the wet grass. I turned back to the house, and in one of the windows I saw something. A thick, black shadow darting from window to window, maddened by the anger of hopelessness. She was looking at us. I miraculously saved Sarah. We were just lucky. We did not cross the threshold of this diabolical house again. An open wound. We returned to the city, but the nights did not bring us peace. I saw Sarah wake up in a cold sweat, her eyes wandering around the room, as if she expected the shadows to appear again. I also couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was left with us. The house we left was no longer just a building, it was something alive. One night I heard a faint whisper coming from a dark corner of the bedroom.
"You will come back."
I knew that the house would not let us go. He will always be waiting.
"You will come back."